In this video, I will explain you everything you need to know about the timeline. You come across the different options on the timeline nearly with everything you do in After Effects, so it's very important to get familiar with its layout and to learn a few options in its setup right at the beginning. The timeline covers the entire bottom area of the program. Let us start with the tabs which are here. Those tabs are compositions. Once you open a composition, it opens in a new tab on the timeline panel. You can click on the X sign to close different compositions and open up a few of their options in this button, about which we will talk later. Okay, I will close the second composition. Let me go back to the main composition and start explaining the timeline. We will start at the far top left side, and here we have informations about where we are on our timeline. You can notice on the timeline this composition has about 6 seconds of duration and they are playing 30 frames per second. The timer on the left shows you where you are on the timeline. You can click and drag around to move around the timeline. On the bottom we have frames and the frames per second of this particular composition. If I hit Ctrl or Command and click here, I have the frames on the top, because sometimes when you're doing animations, you do not want to work with time, you want to see frames because you are editing something frame by frame. You can also hold down the Alt key to move slower, because normally it goes very fast, but if I hold the Alt key, it gets me a bit slower. The same is with the Shift key. The Shift key makes me go very fast here. Okay, I prefer the seconds, so I once again hit Ctrl or Command and click here to have the seconds as the first, and if I would like to navigate here, I can press and I can go to 1 second by hitting 1 and a dot. If I would only write here 1, I will go to the first frame, because this is listed as frames, seconds, minutes and hours. Next up is the search bar. It is sometimes used if you want to open up a different property in a layer, for example the scale, for all of the layers. I hit Ctrl or Command A to select all layers and I write scale. This will open the scale property for each layer. This is a neat little shortcut if you have to edit several properties each time in each layer the same thing. Okay, let's not talk more about the search bar. Now there is something very important to know about layers and compositions. On our timeline, those items are the layers which we are working on. Those layers are inside of the main composition. Several options we are editing are related to those icons, but you can notice that, for example, this icon and this icon looks the same. Also this little icon and this icon looks the same. So why do we have it twice here? Because those icons are specific to each layer and those icons apply to the entire composition. I can, for example, turn on the motion blur for the first 3 layers, but they will be not visible until I turn on the motion blur for the entire composition. And this is a general rule to remember. Okay, let's not skip parts. Let's go from the far left side. On the left side, we can turn on the visibility, turn on or off the sound if you want to hear the sound of a certain layer. For example, this video has some sound in it. I press double L to view the waveform. Well, it actually doesn't have a real sound, but since this is a video, After Effects tells us that it has a sound channel. That's not important in this moment. The next is solo layers. Once you click here, you can display only one layer in this entire composition, and this is a very useful option. For example, I would like to see the text, but I'm not certain where the text is, so I just press the solo layer here, and I can see the text layer is on the top side. The solo layer is not available here because those 2 layers are linked with a track matte. I will turn off the solo layer. Next up we have our lock option. The lock option is very useful if you click something and drag around by mistake. For example, if I would click here, I would move the adjustment layer, I would move the background, but I never want the background to move. What I have to do is click the lock layer, and now I cannot click on it. I can open it, but I cannot change any effects. I cannot touch anything until I will unlock it. Let me close that down, and this brings us to the next item. You probably already noticed that I'm clicking very often on this triangle. This triangle opens up the properties of each different layer. For example, this layer has some effects on it. It has a 4-color gradient. Let me maybe place it back in the middle. Everything which is done to a layer, for example, added effects, changed sizes, added keyframes, can be found in the properties. We will have a separate tutorial about the properties because they are very important. Right now you only have to see an overview that each property can be found here. As I added in the 4-color gradient effect, I can edit the effect here, but I can also open up this property, open up the 4-color gradient, and edit my options here. This is when it comes down to properties. I have every possible property and I can even add more, but we will jump into that later. Next up is our label color. We can change the label colors as we have learned in the lesson about options. We can click, change the color, and this is also useful if you want to select all labels with the same color. I click on this red label, I click select label group, and this will select all layers which are affected with the same color. Next up is our layer number, and this is very important because sometimes you are hiding layers, like we will do in a moment. I will hide a few layers, I'll shy them down, and I can see I have number 1 and immediately number 5. This tells me that somewhere underneath in this composition, not visible to me right now, are a few layers. I'll turn this back on and let us go forward. These are the names of the layers. You can notice on the top side we have source name, and if I click once here, I get layer name, because you can have the original source names and your private layer names. I would, for example, like this to be called text, this to be called video, and maybe this layer to be called adjustment. Now, if you want to remember how the original layer was named, you only click here and you have the source names: Facebook address moth, text, and adjustment layer 1. But if I go to my private names, I have adjustment, text, and video. I made a small mistake here, sorry for that. Okay, this is when it comes to layer names and source names. A few more things I want to show you, because some of those things will have its own separate tutorials, but for now, a nice function which I showed you a while ago is shying layers. Shying allows us to hide certain layers. For example, I've made those 3 red solids and I know that I will no longer need them in my current state of events. What I can do is click this little shy guy, it will hide behind the wall, hide this, and activate the shy layers for this entire composition. This will hide or reveal the layers which have the shy button activated. I can go back just by clicking it, but for now I don't need those medium solids, so I'll shy them off. Next up is our collapse transformations button, which we'll talk about later as well, but for vector layers, you can notice it says continuously rasterize. This button indicates me that this is a vector layer, and I can scale it as much as I want. It will be always perfectly visible, and After Effects will rasterize it continuously. The next button is to turn down the quality of certain layers. If some layers are very heavy, in most cases you do not have to use this button, but if something is very heavy for your PC and you want to lower its quality just for the sake of your work and that you work faster, you can lower down the quality by clicking on this icon. This icon indicates that it will have lower quality. Let me go back to the original and move forward. The next button allows us to turn on or turn off effects of a layer. As I click on my red wall, I will unlock it. I have here 2 effects, the tritone and the curves. I could turn this effect off, turn this effect off, but if I would like to do this with one click, I can click here and turn all effects off for this particular layer. I'll turn them back on and let's move forward. We have 3 buttons here: the motion blur, the adjustment layer, and the 3D layer. This allows us to turn motion blur on for a layer to make our movements more realistic. Let me maybe turn this on for this layer because this is moving, and for the entire composition. And as the red text animation happens, you see it gets a little blur, exactly like here. without motion blur, it would just have a static movement. So if you want your animations to look a bit cooler, you only have to turn on motion blur. Motion blur should be used not for every animation, but it depends on the project you are doing. I'll turn motion blur off for this composition and for this layer. This little icon shows us that a particular layer is an adjustment layer. You can turn this on and off for other layers as well. This layer is an adjustment. It has a 4-color gradient because I just wanted to pop up some colors. If I turn this off, the entire screen will turn white because I have the blending mode set to soft light and the opacity to 100%. If I go to none, I will only see the gradient. But I wanted it to be an adjustment layer, so I clicked this and I made the blending mode to soft light. Now it's better visible and it only adjusts the layers under it. The third icon here is very important because it turns any object into the third dimension. What means the third dimension? Let me click this shape layer and press P. I have the position on the x-axis and on the y-axis. But here I have turned on 3D and I have another axis, which is the z-axis. The z-axis allows us not only to move left and right, but also operate on close and far. This is very useful to create, for example, simple animations that it would fade off, or you can work with 2-view cameras. Let me quickly create 2 views. On the left side, we see this image from top. On the right side, we see this from front. As I see it from top, I can move the Z layer to be closer and more far away. On the right, you see the graphical interpretation of what I'm doing with the Z-axis. Let me turn one view back again and continue explaining the things on the timeline.